Good morning. It's great to be with you today and really good to be starting this new series, We Believe. I wonder how you respond to things like creeds. I know that when I first became a Christian, that kind of thing, anything that smacked of being liturgical was a real turnoff for me. But as I've gone on in my faith, I've come to really appreciate this kind of thing. I think there's a power in the sort of thing that we've been looking at this morning as Mike read that creed to us, as we're going to explore it through this series. There's a power that is like when we echo the words of the Lord's Prayer together, or even more so when we take the bread and the cup and we share communion together. There's something in this kind of thing that stretches across continents and down through centuries. And if that sounds a bit weird to you, what I mean is that these words are words that will be shared by millions of Christians across the world today. Literally millions of believers in Jesus will speak these same words to one another, will affirm these same truths. And the same is true in history, isn't it? That this creed, as Mike was saying, stretches back to the very earliest generations of the church, born out of the words of the apostles and spoken through the generations right up until today. And so as we look at these truths together, as we explore them, as we affirm this simple, beautiful distillation of the Christian faith, we are joining with believers right down through the centuries and right across the globe. I mean, that should give you tingles, shouldn't it? And not only that, I think it's really helpful for people like us in our generations to look at something like this. We've said, haven't we, over the last couple of years, that we live in a time that is marked by post-truth, where people play pretty fast and loose with the truth, where what is innovative, what is trendy often takes precedent over what is old and tried and tested. But here in this creed, we have tried and tested truths, truths that Christians have lived by and have died for millennia. And so for people like us, I think it's so helpful for us to sit with these truths, to meditate on them, to think what they mean for us in our generation. And especially at a time like the one that we're in at the moment, that's marked with such flux, where there's such uncertainty, to be anchored in these truths is really helpful. So I'm glad that we're doing this together. And this morning we jump in with the first couple of lines. I believe in God the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. And to help us with that, we're going to be looking at that psalm that Jess and John, Evelyn and Ezra read to us so helpfully just a few moments ago. Psalm 104. So if you've got a Bible with you, do have that open as we're looking through this. We'll be kind of jumping into different verses as we go through. And this is one of many places in our Old Testaments where we get a portrait of God as creator. We could have gone to Genesis 1. And I decided to go here because it combines those two themes of the creed, that God is creator, but God is also father, sustainer. We'll come to that in a moment. And actually, this psalm, it kind of riffs off of Genesis 1 anyway. If Genesis 1 was like a Mozart concerto, then this is like a kind of free jazz arrangement of the same stuff. It has melodies and motifs that you'll recognize, but it tells the story. It sings the music in its own kind of particular style. So look with me at Psalm 104. Praise the Lord, my soul. Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. It's a song full of praise. I'm sure you will have heard that as we were reading it earlier together. And it actually maps pretty well onto the 6 days that we find in Genesis chapter 1. Look at verse 2 with me. The Lord wraps himself in light. Think of that first day of creation. Let there be light. And look at the second part of verse 2. He stretches out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his upper chambers on their waters. He makes the cloud his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. He makes winds his messengers and flames of fire his servants. Day 2 of the creation is all about separating water from water, just as we read in those verses. And then in day 3, and this is really where this psalm camps out and spends a bit of time, God creates the dry land. He creates habitats for all kinds of creatures and ultimately for humanity as well. Look at verse 5. He sets the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths, as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. But at your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. They flowed over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, to the place you assigned for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. It's this psalm's own unique way of retelling what we read about in Genesis 1, of that third day when God brings dry land out, makes a space, a safe place for us to live. I mean, jump down to verse 14 and we get a sense of the Father who cares for living creatures. Verse 14, he makes the grass grow for the cattle and plants for the people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth. Wine that gladdens human hearts, oil that makes their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. The trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he plants. There the birds make their nests. The stork has its home in the junipers. The high mountains belong to the wild goat. The crags are a refuge for the hyrax. Do you see this sense that God has provided all the habitat we need, all the food that we need? This Father, this Creator. In verse 19, actually, we move on to the themes of day 4 in the Genesis 1 account. At this point in Genesis 1, God has made 3 spheres where things can exist, and he begins to fill them up. In the heavens, he fills them up with the heavenly bodies. Look at verse 19. He made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. You bring darkness, it becomes night, and all the beasts prowl around. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. The sun rises and they steal away. They return and lie down in their dens. Then people go out to work, to their labor until evening. At this point, this is where it feels very much like a jazz arrangement. He just bursts out into praise. This is like a kind of sudden burst of saxophone in solo mode. How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom, you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. This psalm, you can see it begins, it ends, it's shot through with praise to this God who made everything, through whom everything was created, and to whom everything looks to be sustained. He then jumps in verse 25 into day 5. The seas and the sky are filled with creatures at that point in the Genesis account. And here we read in verse 25, there is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. Now at this point, it's hard to discern whether the day 6 stuff comes in, the animals of the dry land and human beings. We've heard them mentioned all the way through here. But maybe this is where we get the strongest feel for that. In verse 27, all creatures look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. When you hide your face, they are terrified. And when you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. This is a psalm that reflects on so much of the diversity of our created world. The psalmist, you can kind of imagine him looking around and seeing all the different things that God has made, seeing the beauty in the plant life and the animal life, in the heavens, all the stars and the sun and the moon. And these things just lead him to praise. And just imagine if this psalmist was given a microscope or a telescope to see the things that we have seen that he couldn't even imagine. I mean, his idea of what exists on this world, the complexity of God's creation, is just a fraction of what really exists. Even with our modern technology, there's so much that we just don't know. So much more for us to see of God's glory in creation. And that's where verse 31 picks up. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord all my life. I will sing praise to my God as long as I live. May my meditation be pleasing to him as I rejoice in the Lord. But may sinners vanish from the earth and the wicked be no more. Praise the Lord, my soul. praise the Lord. And so as we read through this psalm, what we see is the psalmist worshipping God for the simple reason that we have in the creed today. The little section that we're looking at says that God is creator, that he is father. And these two things come together so beautifully in this psalm. God is the one who has made everything. But we also read here that he's the one who is intimately involved in his creation, right up to the point where this psalmist is writing, and right up to the present day that we live into. Did you notice that this isn't a God who is far off? There was a movement in theology that's been come to be known as deism. The idea that God created the world, he kind of winded up and set it ticking, and then just steps back. He's aloof from the world, apart from the odd occasion when he steps in and gets involved. But this is so far from what we see here in Psalm 101. The impression we get here is that every day, every single creature owes their existence to God. He provides for them. He's not just the creator, he is the sustainer, the father who cares for and provides for his creation. And actually, the way that the psalmist expresses this is really amazing, isn't it? I mean, look, for example, at verse 14 and 15 and 16. We read them earlier. In this account of something like the third day of creation, with God creating space for people to live and to dwell, and for animals too. It says here, he makes the grass grow for the cattle and the plants for people to cultivate. But then he goes on to talk about how humans are sustained by oil and by wine and by bread. Now, the last time I checked, you don't get fields teeming with bread, do you? There's wheat that grows in the fields, but that has to be harvested and milled and combined with water and yeast and salt and baked in the oven to turn it into a loaf of bread. I mean, the same is true for wine, right? You don't just kind of turn a tap on a vine and see the wine come out. The fruit has to be picked and processed and fermented. And only then do you have something you can drink. But the way the psalmist sees it, all of these things, whether they're so-called natural or so-called man-made, they all come from the gracious hand of God. I mean, even a little bit later on with the description of the sea creatures, there's a legitimate reading of that where it's not just the fish in the sea and the Leviathan, this strange sea monster, that are God's creation, but also, in a way, the boats that skim across the surface of the water. Everything, whether it comes, we like to think, directly from God, or whether it passes through the hands and the ingenuity of human beings that he's made, is a gift from him. And this is actually the way that the New Testament sees things too. There's a verse in the book of James that says that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father to us. And I think we need to hear this especially in our own generation, in this cultural moment. I think it can be very easy to believe our own hype, to think that we are pretty much autonomous creatures. We exist by our own ingenuity, by our own ability to earn money, to buy food, to put a roof over our heads. And this way of thinking is totally contra to what we see here. What we see in this passage is that all of these things are gifts to us from God. I think, if anything, actually, this last year has shaken that sense of autonomy that a lot of us believed. We've seen all sorts of things that we had relied on be shaken. And I think we've probably got more of a sense of our fragility, of the futility of it all. But this psalm reassures us that even when things that we tend to rely on feel shaky, there is a God who made it all, who provides for his creation. A creator and a provider, God the Father. And as we think about this, in the second part this morning, I want us to think about how that belief might shape the kind of people that we are. Actually, that's something which we should probably be thinking about every week during this series, because beliefs should change the way that we act, the way that we think, the way that we approach the world, don't you think? I mean, when we talk about belief, sometimes we imagine it's just something I think. It's kind of just mental assent. But actually, belief should transform the way that we see the world and we see ourselves in it. And I think that's what biblical belief is all about. And so, what does it mean to believe that God is the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, that He has made and that He sustains everything? Well, I think one thing that it should do is it should turn us into people whose lives are marked by gratitude. That's the first mark, I think, gratitude. And you see that in this psalm, don't you? That the psalmist is just incredibly grateful, incredibly thankful to God for all the things that he receives, for God's amazing generosity to this world. And one of the things that I've been challenged by over the years is how we build into our lives rhythms that help us to live out gratitude, to help us to acknowledge God. As I said, it's so easy with the modern mindset to not see God's part in any of this. And so we have to be intentional, I think, about reminding ourselves that God is the one who gives us every good gift. And one simple way that maybe is normal in your family life or in your home is saying grace, saying thank you for food. And I think this is just such an important thing to do, to acknowledge at every point that God is the one who gives us the food on our tables. The food that we're munching away on in our mouths is a gift from Him. With our monthly salaries or benefit payments or whatever it might be, your pension that provides for these things, with supermarkets just around the corner with neatly packaged food. You tap on your phone and a Deliveroo turns up with a hot meal. It can be easy to forget that God is the one who gives us these things, that without Him, we would have nothing. And one of the simple ways we can remind ourselves is to say thank you to Him. I would imagine lots of you do this already. Around the meal table, you stop before you eat and you say thank you, a simple prayer of thanks. But I wonder if you struggle with the same kind of thing as me, that this happens quite regularly when you're, I don't know, up at the table, there's a knife and a fork, it's a proper meal. Or this happens regularly when you're with other people. But do you do the same thing when you're on your own? When it's just you tucking into a sandwich, or when you're eating a biscuit that you've dunked in your cup of tea? Do you still instinctively thank your Creator for that gift of food? I think maybe that betrays a bit of a woodenness, a bit of a routine, rather than a genuine sense of overflowing gratitude. I mean, this is something which I remember mentioning in a sermon a while back, and it's to my shame that this hasn't embedded in my life in the way that it should have done. But actually, someone who believes that God is creator and sustainer of everything should have a life that is marked by amazing gratitude. The whole day should be just a constant stream of thanks to Him as we notice the signs of His goodness in food and in all kinds of other things. Simple gratitude. So that's the first thing. A person who believes in this should see their life marked by increasing gratitude. The second thing is that someone who believes these statements, that God is the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, should see their life beginning to be marked more and more by trust. Often in the Bible, when you read the stories of God and Israel, or of Jesus and His disciples, what is happening is these people are being taught to trust, taught to believe that they can lean heavily on God. I mean, one of the examples I can think of is when the people of Israel are in the wilderness. They're traveling through, and day by day they are fed by God with this strange, weird food called manna. Every day it appears, and every day they can gather enough for that day, but just for that day. Anything more will be rotten in the morning. And what God was teaching the people during that season in their life as a nation was to trust Him. Literally, as Jesus prays centuries later, to trust Him for their daily bread. That this Father who loves them provides. And that they don't need to trust in their own ingenuity. They don't need to trust in their savviness. They need to trust in Him. And this is such a challenge to us, isn't it? Of course, I don't think this means that we shouldn't save, that we shouldn't be wise or prudent with our resources, that we shouldn't steward them carefully to be able to meet our needs and the needs of the people that we care for. But what it does mean is that we should move away from greed or hoarding or the kinds of things that lead us to into patterns of life where it betrays that we don't trust him. Very often, you imagine if the people in the wilderness had tents full of this manna stuff, very quickly they'd lose sight of the God who provides it. But that day by day reliance taught them to lean heavily on him. Now, of course, they came out of the wilderness, they came into the land, and during that time, lots of them were sustained by farming, where they would harvest once a year. They'd bring the food in, and that would need to last them through the long winter months. Be no good going out each day to try and find the food in the field because it just didn't work like that. And it's the same today, isn't it? For many of us, you might get a monthly salary, or perhaps you have a period in your self-employment when you have a busy time of year, and then there's a quieter time of year, and you have to kind of balance your cash flow to make sure that that works okay for you across the course of a year. But what we're talking about here is a sense of trust in God, to be satisfied with God's enough, to be content with what he provides, rather than constantly searching, desperately longing for more. One of the ways that followed through Israel's history, beyond the kind of manna period into their settled time in the land, was the rhythm of Sabbath. And one of the things about the Sabbath, which is really countercultural then and now, is to deliberately limit your productivity. They could be working 7 days a week. They could work their land every single day of the year for every single year of the decade. They could work the people who work for them as hard as they could. But Sabbath breaks that. And in breaking that, you restrict your productivity. You're not able to produce as much. And this is one of the ways that Israel was taught not to constantly, in a kind of anxious way, acquire as much as they possibly could, but to be satisfied and content with what God provides for them. Another example of this is the laws around gleaning in the Old Testament law, where when they were gathering the food in their fields, they wouldn't gather absolutely every piece of wheat that they could harvest. There'd be some left over. To be able to trust God and to be content in his enough, rather than always stretching out for more. That's a mark of someone whose life is being shaped by this belief that God is creator of all. And beyond that, actually, the gleaning law is a really good example of this. It links us into another related thing, which is to have a life marked by generosity. I think this is really important. And it's shown in that gleaning law that the young people in our church in Groundbreakers have been learning about the story of Ruth. And it's a wonderful story in the Old Testament where a woman who is a widow, who is an immigrant, who's had to move from her own country and finds herself living in Israel, is blessed by these gleaning laws. She is someone without rights and without much stability in life, but she is fed because of this kind of generous outlook in the law that God sets. And I think this is a connected thing here, isn't it? As we read through this psalm and we see just the beauty of God's creation, but also God's love of it all. It's interesting. It says, doesn't it, at the end, may the Lord rejoice in his works. This creation that God has made, it brings him joy. He loves all of the different aspects of this, the human, the plant life, the animal life, the fish in the sea, the birds in the air. All of this is something that gives him joy and something that he provides for. And people who recognize God's generosity should begin to live lives that echo that generosity, lives that are marked by that generosity. Of course, we see all around us, don't we, examples of how that failure to trust God, whether that's because of fear or because of greed, has an impact on other people. Especially here in the West, I think it's very clear, isn't it, that our own fears and greed has had a huge impact on the world and on poorer communities around the world. I mean, I probably don't need to mention examples. You can think of them yourself. But just think of how many conflicts there have been around the world over natural resources. Think of how our oceans are awash with plastic because of excess, mostly of Western countries. Think about how our overuse of kind of petrol and diesel and emissions has caused climate change and rises in sea levels that affect some of the poorest people in the world far more than they will ever affect us. I mean, think, for example, of how our appetite for beef means that habitats are destroyed and set aside to graze cattle rather than what they are intended for. There's all these sorts of things where our lack of trust in God, resulting in either greed or in fear, actually means that other people lose out as a result. I mean, one very kind of um, immediate example, if we take what Psalm 104 talks about here, that the things that God makes are a part of God's goodness to his world. Sorry, the things that people make are a part of his goodness to the world. Then we could ask questions around the vaccine, couldn't we? I think it's wonderful, isn't it, that we've got over 15 million people vaccinated in our nation. That's fantastic news. But I'm also really pleased that in the news this weekend, there's been so much talk about how richer countries can support poorer countries in seeing vaccinations there. I mean, it is shocking, isn't it, that 75% of the vaccines that have been given out in the world today have been administered in 10 countries. There are 130 countries on our planet that have not had a single dose of the vaccine yet. As we think about bread and wine and oil, we can add to that medicines. And in all of these things, we see here a God who is concerned for his whole world, a God who is concerned for all of creation, a God who is concerned that the whole world is blessed, that everyone is enriched. And I know these are complicated things. I know that the answers are not simple. I don't want to make them simplistic. But in our intentions, in our hearts, as we're gripped by a sense of God as creator, as father, as provider of all, this should begin to work into our hearts and shape us into people who long to be generous. Well, as we move on from this, we've got people who are marked by gratitude, people who are marked by trust, people who are marked by generosity. And finally, I think we're called to be people who are marked by hope. As we look at this psalm, it sounds really beautiful, really idyllic, doesn't it? The reality is our world is far from that. And perhaps that's actually where verse 35 comes in. I read one commentary that said that in an otherwise beautiful poem, we have this line that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, doesn't it? But may sinners vanish from the earth and the wicked be no more. I mean, what's that all about? This is a really lovely meditation on the glorious planet that we live in, all the amazing beauty of God's creation. And here is this kind of nasty line about getting rid of the sinners. But actually, there's an important point here, isn't there? There's something about the way that humans are that is just incompatible with this vision of creation, with this vision of a bountiful, blessed world. There's something in humanity that rages against that. I mean, we see it in the account in Genesis, from the fall in Genesis 3 onwards, how humans are somehow incompatible with God's original intentions for this good creation. But as we read on into the New Testament, we find real hope, because the answer is not simply to destroy the people who are destroying this world. The answer is for them to be remade. If we jump to Romans chapter 8, here we see just one particular angle on why the Christian message is such good news. We see as we read through the New Testament that Jesus is the only human being who ever lives up to what humans were meant to be. He truly is the image of God. And we read in Romans chapter 8 that actually this creation in all its beauty and all its diversity and all its glory is crying out to be made new. Look with me at verse 18 of chapter 8. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And Paul talks about how our world, you think of rainforests, you think of oceans, you think of rising sea levels, you think of all these things, ways in which our creation is groaning. And the world, it longs to be renewed. And the promise of the New Testament is that God will do it. The hope that we live for, and this is really where the first lines of the creed link to the last ones with life everlasting in a new creation, a renewed creation. And the hope is actually the same as was set out at the beginning of the Bible, that this new creation will be reigned over by human beings who don't tread down creation, but shepherd it wisely. And of course, that happens in Jesus, but we read a little bit further down in Romans chapter 8, that we, God's people, are the ones who are being conformed into the image of that Son. For those of us who are Christians, those of us who have God's Spirit living in us, God is changing us. As we thought earlier about being people of gratitude and trust and generosity, probably all of us realize that we fall far short from this. But the work of God in us is to change us by his Spirit, bit by bit, and ultimately when Jesus returns, to be the kinds of people he always intended for us to be. People who will rule over his world, his renewed creation, perfectly forever. So we can be people too whose lives are marked with hope in a world that is often messed up, that although it's beautiful is also broken. We can be people who trust in the God who will one day make it new. And so if we're people who affirm this, people who believe that God is the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, we want to pray that God would work these things through in us so that we become people whose lives are marked by gratitude, by trust in him, by generosity towards others and towards his creation, and by hope. And I guess as well, where we started, lives that are marked by worship. The psalm begins and it ends with those simple words, praise the Lord. And so now we're going to do that. We're going to sing together a song of praise to our great creator, our Father, the sustainer, the one who provides. Let's sing together, Indescribable.